Destin, after they had their little social evening last night, Brandon Marcello is covering the event. And I'm curious as we begin this conversation, Brandon Marcello from 24/7 Sports joining us on the Farm Bureau phone line. How much access is there, Brandon? This is not an event that I've been to. I've started to go and thought it probably makes sense a bunch of times, but how much access do you actually have to coaches and ADs and administrators?
Well, it just depends. If you have to chase them down when they're exiting their meetings. For example, right now I'm standing about 80 feet away from where the coaches are all meeting. All the football coaches are meeting, and they are going to exit around 5 o'clock. And it's a matter of chasing some of them down, seeing if any of them want to talk. And a lot of it's just unofficial chatter and nothing on the record or anything like that. But, there are the organized little press conferences we have. We've had a few already earlier this morning, but those were before meetings, so they weren't necessarily very informative from the coaches. But I like coming here because it's a little bit more informal. It's not like media days where everything's so structured and everybody's standing behind a podium.
And you are better positioned, Brandon, to chase down coaches now than you were a couple of years ago.
That's right.
I mean that in the most complimentary way possible.
No, man, I appreciate that. Yeah, I've lost a lot of weight. In fact, I've seen some administrators here that I haven't seen since before I did that, and they're like, wow, I don't even recognize you. I've lost a little over 140 pounds, and now the real tough part begins. That's maintaining it and, just continue to improve my lifestyle and make sure it lasts my entire life.
Yeah, well, good on you for doing that. Hey, there are so many storylines going on this week, and we kind of got derailed with the Jimbo Saban thing for a couple of weeks ago. Is that an afterthought at this point? I know maybe not for the people that are covering it, but among league officials and the coaches themselves, have they just kind of moved on from that, do you think?
A little bit, yeah, and I think they have. It's interesting because the coaches, all of them, even when they're not named Saban or Fisher, getting lots of questions about that little public spat between the two. But I think the underlying issue here, of course, is NIL. And I think, Eli Drinkowitz, the Mizzou coach, put it pretty well this morning. He says whenever there's something that is just boiling under the surface that we're all dealing with, it's very stressful. Emotions start to get high. And as a result, people start to say things that maybe exaggerate what they actually believe, and though there might be some truth to it, maybe they don't necessarily mean it, and they start lashing out. And I think that that's somewhat true when it comes to this with Jimbo Fisher and Nick Saban and what they've said in their war of words. I mean, really today, one of the few times you will see Nick Saban his entire career where today he was kind of he was backing off a little bit on Jimbo Fisher and kind of being very careful with his words, crossing his arms, looking down, trying to be very diplomatic about everything, even saying, hey, I don't have, any issues with Jimbo Fisher. And I never said that, Texas A&M, cheated, but then he has followed up with a reporter, and the reporter says, but you said they bought their players. And he said, well, I should not have, pointed out Texas A&M or any individual institution. So, again, I think emotions, like any fight you have with a spouse or something like that. You say things you don't really mean, but you say it just because you're really, really emotional and angry. And I think that's what's going on. And things like this probably won't be the last time we see something like this, not necessarily from those two, but across the country because, listen, they're not going to figure out this NIL situation, how to properly regulate it for years. This is a way too complex of an issue, and it's all about competitive inequity. And how do you equalize that? And more importantly, how is that even possible when we're talking about 130 FBS schools and none of those schools are the same? It seems like an impossible task.
Yeah, isn't the answer to that you don't without getting sued almost immediately?
Yeah, I mean that's a big thing. I mean, I think that what we're getting into is that if you want to properly regulate this and do what a lot of these coaches want, you got to shrink down the issue. You got to make it smaller. How do you do that? I think you have to shrink membership down. So, a certain set of schools have a certain set of guidelines that they develop, and they are all playing against each other, and they're not necessarily playing the others outside their bubble, and which, again, leads more credence to the idea that in the future, one thing could lead to another, and we get to a point where FBS football, or for that matter, power football, is just 20 or 30 teams, and it makes it easier to regulate, and they have more autonomy compared to the other 100 or so schools. But again, that's a tough ask because you're talking about making a lot of mid-range to lower-range schools and football programs potentially obsolete in the near future.
Yeah. Visiting with Brandon Marcello from 24/7 Sports. He is at the Destin Hilton in, as Borky told us officially, Miramar Beach, Florida, earlier today. The conversation about scheduling, and I know so NIL is a debate and a conversation and a discussion topic, but it's one that has no immediate answer in sight. And kind of maybe the same thing with the transfer portal because the rules are what the rules are. But in terms of something that these coaches and these administrators have control over, it's the future scheduling model in the SEC. Ross Dellinger wrote a couple of weeks ago about an 8-team and a 9-team option that are kind of all that's left on the table. Where does that end up?
I think ultimately they will go to the 9-game schedule, and I think it will be the 3-6 rotation where it's 3 permanent opponents and 6 rotating opponents that go around every other year. I was writing a story for tomorrow on all of this, and a lot of people want to know what the coaches think. Well, it's really not going to matter, and I hate saying that, but the coaches are kind of powerless in this. In the end, this is a decision that will be made by the presidents and chancellors of this conference, and all signs are pointing to them going to a 9-game conference schedule. It increases television inventory, which will increase, obviously, money and revenue. In addition to that, it will strengthen the conference to whatever postseason format that the college football playoff, or if the SEC decides to do its own playoff, which I think is unlikely, is in place for 2026 and beyond. So it just makes a lot of sense. And though the coaches are pretty much split on it, and the root of that really is about eliminating divisions, it's pretty much split there. In the end, they will have to move forward and do what's best for the conference. And by all means, the communication has been the best thing for the conference is to go to a 9-game schedule.
Brandon, some of the NCAA restrictions have lifted, allowing conferences to determine who gets to participate in its championship game. At different times in recent years, we've heard about the idea of eliminating the conference championship game because too many games on the schedule. The SEC has always pushed back on that idea because it has been an absolute revenue cash cow. Is there any scenario where if we end up at 9 conference games, the SEC takes a different approach or a different stance on the SEC championship game?
It's possible. You have seen the reports from ESPN about them potentially looking at, or actually they are looking at doing their own SEC playoff, which my understanding is the initial discussions there involves 8 teams in the SEC, and then from that would crown an SEC champion. And then, of course, there's a lot of ways to go from there. You could take your SEC champion and pit it against the champion of, say, an alliance playoff or the champion of the Big Ten, where maybe they don't have a playoff of their own, but they just have a Big Ten championship game. And, say, maybe the Sugar Bowl or something like that ends up being your de facto national championship or your championship game between those two conferences. Again, a lot of hypotheticals on top of hypotheticals on top of hypotheticals, but you got to weigh all that. As Greg Sankey called it, blue sky thinking. What can we do in a perfect world where there are no obstacles in our way? Because at this point, there are so many obstacles, it's almost silly to consider things as if you're able to, do 15 different scenarios for every little thing and every problem that might pop up. So create these ideas on a blank sheet of paper and see if it's possible to implement that, whether it's now or in the future.
Going to be pretty fascinating over the next few years to see where college football ends up.